The morning sun filtered through the blinds as Maya Johnson checked her appearance one last time in the mirror. Today was important. She smoothed down her simple navy blue blazer, adjusted her pearl earrings, and took a deep breath. At 37, Maya had built a career most people would envy. 15 years of solid marketing experience, an MBA from a top university, and a track record of successful campaigns that had turned struggling products into market leaders. "You look perfect," came a voice from behind her. Maya turned to see her husband, James Wilson, leaning against the doorway of their bedroom, coffee mug in hand, watching her with a mix of pride and concern. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, crossing the room to stand beside her. "You know you don't have to do it this way." Maya smiled and straightened his already perfect tie, a habit she'd developed in their 8 years of marriage. "Yes, I'm sure. I need to do this, James. Not as your wife, but as myself." James nodded, understanding her reasons even if he didn't fully agree with them. As the recently appointed CEO of Summit Technologies, he could have simply created a position for Maya. Many would have expected it. But that wasn't how either of them worked. Maya had always made her own way in the world, had always insisted on earning her achievements through merit alone. "Besides," she added, picking up her simple leather portfolio, "we both know something isn't right with the company culture. The employee satisfaction scores are down. Turnover is up, especially among women and minorities. This is a chance to see things from the inside without anyone knowing who I'm married to." James sighed. "That's exactly what worries me." "You shouldn't have to deal with what?" Maya challenged, raising an eyebrow. "With whatever other candidates deal with?" "That's exactly the point." She kissed him on the cheek and headed toward the door, pausing to look back. "Remember, as far as anyone at Summit knows today, I'm just Maya Johnson, not Maya Wilson Johnson. I'm using my professional name, my own credentials, and coming in through the front door like everyone else. And if they treat you badly?" James asked quietly. Maya's expression grew serious. "Then we'll know there's a bigger problem to fix, won't we?" The drive to Summit Technologies took 30 minutes, giving Maya time to mentally review her preparation. The position of marketing director was perfect, senior enough to make an impact but not so high that James would be directly involved in the hiring process. She had researched the company thoroughly, knew its products, competitors, and market challenges. On paper, she was an ideal candidate. Maya arrived 20 minutes early, giving herself time to observe. The gleaming glass building reflected the morning sunlight, looking every bit the successful tech company it was. Inside, the reception area was modern and welcoming, with the company's awards prominently displayed. "Good morning," Maya greeted the receptionist with a warm smile. "I'm Maya Johnson. I have an interview at 9:30 for the marketing director position." The young man at the desk returned her smile and checked his computer. "Yes, Ms. Johnson, welcome to Summit Technologies. If you could fill out these forms, I'll let Mr. Cooper know you're here." Maya took a seat in the waiting area, completed the paperwork efficiently, and then used the remaining time to observe the office dynamics. People moved purposefully through the lobby, some chatting in groups, others focused on their phones or laptops. She noticed a decent mix of people, different ages, several races, but couldn't help observing that all the people who appeared to be in leadership positions, based on their more formal attire and confident demeanor, were predominantly white men. Interesting, she thought. The company's website had emphasized its commitment to diversity, but the reality seemed somewhat different. At 9:30, Maya checked the time discreetly. The receptionist noticed and smiled apologetically. "I'm sure Mr. Cooper will be with you shortly. Can I get you some water or coffee while you wait?" "Water would be lovely, thank you," Maya replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the early sign of disrespect. Being late to an interview showed poor time management at best, and a power play at worst. By 9:45, Maya had observed 13 people walk past, noticed the company's quarterly targets posted on a wall display, ambitious but achievable, and spotted 2 typos in their lobby marketing materials. Someone in her potential department wasn't paying attention to detail. She made mental notes but kept her expression pleasant and patient. At 10:15, 45 minutes after her scheduled time, a man finally approached. He was in his late 40s with thinning hair and an expensive suit that seemed slightly too tight across his shoulders. "Ms. Johnson?" he said, not quite making eye contact as he checked his phone. Richard Cooper, head of HR. Sorry about the wait. Busy morning. Let's head back to my office. Maya stood, extending her hand for a shake. No problem at all. Thank you for making time to see me today. Richard's handshake was brief and limp, his eyes finally meeting hers for just a second before flicking away to check his phone again. Maya noted his dismissive body language but followed him through the security doors and down a hallway lined with meeting rooms. As they walked, Richard made no attempt at small talk or to establish rapport, standard practice for most professional interviewers. Maya noticed a few more things. The walls featured photographs of company events, and while the lower-level staff appeared diverse, the leadership team in the photos was noticeably homogeneous. Richard's office was spacious but impersonal. No family photos. No personal touches beyond generic motivational posters and his framed degrees. He gestured to a chair across from his desk without offering water or coffee, despite the half-empty cup steaming on his desk. So, he began, finally looking at her resume, apparently for the first time. Maya Johnson. You're applying for the marketing director role. Yes, Maya confirmed, maintaining her positive energy. I'm very excited about the opportunity. Summit's approach to integrated software solutions is innovative, and I believe my experience in technology marketing would be a great fit. Richard glanced up, a slight furrow in his brow. Your resume says you have 15 years of experience, but that seems generous. Can you clarify your actual hands-on experience in tech specifically? Maya blinked, taken aback by the immediate challenge to her credibility, but recovered smoothly. Of course. After completing my MBA, I spent 5 years at TechVision developing their consumer outreach, followed by 7 years at GlobalSoft, where I led the team that increased market share by 23% through the Connect Everywhere campaign. For the past 3 years, I've been the senior marketing strategist at Innovations Inc., focusing specifically on software integration solutions similar to Summit's core offerings. She opened her portfolio, ready to show examples of her work, but Richard held up a hand to stop her. We'll get to that. I'm just trying to understand if you have actual experience with the technical side of things. Marketing in tech isn't just about making things look pretty, you know. Maya felt a flicker of irritation but kept her expression neutral. I completely agree. Effective marketing in the tech industry requires a deep understanding of the product functionality, the competitive landscape, and the specific pain points of various user segments. I've worked closely with development teams throughout my career and— Yes, Richard interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. Let's move on to something else. Tell me, how would you handle the pressure of this position? It's quite demanding, lots of tight deadlines, long hours sometimes. Behind her composed exterior, Maya was building a mental list of concerning behaviors. The interruption, the dismissal of her technical knowledge without exploration, the implication that she might not handle pressure well. None of these were standard interview approaches. They were, however, unfortunately familiar to her as a black woman in corporate America. I thrive under pressure, she answered confidently. In my current role, I managed the launch of 3 major products simultaneously last quarter, all of which exceeded their initial adoption targets. I'm known for staying calm and focused during crunch times. My previous supervisor actually nicknamed me the Eye of the Hurricane because everything around me could be chaos. But I remain centered and productive. Richard nodded, but his expression suggested skepticism rather than appreciation. Maya noticed him glancing at his watch, though the interview had barely begun. She pressed on, determined to showcase her qualifications despite his apparent disinterest. I'd be happy to share some specific examples of high-pressure situations I've navigated successfully, she offered, again reaching for her portfolio. That won't be necessary right now, Richard said, making a short note on his pad. Let's talk about cultural fit. Summit has a very specific company culture. We work hard, play hard, that sort of thing. We're like a family here. Do you think you'd fit in with that kind of environment? The emphasis on family and cultural fit raised another red flag for Maya. These terms were often used as coded language to exclude candidates who didn't match the existing demographic profile of a company. Adapt well to various work cultures, Maya replied carefully. I value strong teamwork, open communication, and results-driven environments. I believe diverse perspectives strengthen a team's problem-solving abilities and creativity. In what specific ways would you describe Summit's culture as unique? Richard seemed uncomfortable with the question being turned back on him. Well, we're very collaborative. Lots of team activities, happy hours, that sort of thing. People who succeed here are really, they just fit in naturally with the team. Maya nodded, making her own mental note about the vagueness of his description. As the interview continued, she became increasingly aware that Richard was assessing her differently than he might other candidates. His questions focused less on her skills and accomplishments, and more on whether she would fit in or handle the environment. By the time they reached the end of the formal questions, Maya had a clear picture of what was happening. This wasn't just about an unprepared interviewer or someone having a bad day. This was about bias, perhaps unconscious, but bias nonetheless. "Do you have any questions for me?" Richard asked in the tone of someone who hoped the answer was no. Maya smiled warmly. "Actually, yes. I'd love to know more about the diversity initiatives at Summit. Your website mentions a commitment to inclusive hiring practices. Could you tell me about how that's implemented in the day-to-day operations?" For the first time, Richard looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Well, we certainly follow all equal opportunity requirements. We don't discriminate against anyone, but we also have to consider who will work best with our existing teams, you understand?" Maya understood perfectly, but simply nodded and made a note. "And could you tell me about the reporting structure for this position? Who would I be working with directly?" As Richard described the organizational chart, Maya mentally prepared for the next phase of her plan. She had seen enough to have serious concerns about the hiring practices at her husband's company. Now she needed to determine how deep the problem went and what would happen next. Little did Richard know that this interview was about to take a very unexpected turn. The wall clock in Richard Cooper's office ticked loudly in the silence as he shuffled through Maya's resume papers for the third time. She sat perfectly still, back straight, hands folded neatly on her portfolio in her lap, a posture she'd perfected over years of being the only black woman in countless boardrooms. "So," Richard finally spoke, not looking up from the papers, "your resume says you increased digital engagement by 80% at Innovations Inc. That seems ambitious. Can you explain exactly how that number was calculated?" Maya kept her expression neutral despite having already addressed this in her initial explanation of her work history. "Of course. When I joined Innovations, their digital engagement metrics, which include click-through rates, time spent on site, social media interactions, and conversion rates, were well below industry average. I implemented a comprehensive strategy that included revamping their content approach, personalizing user journeys, and optimizing their mobile experience. The 80% increase is actually a conservative average across all engagement metrics, with some areas seeing over 120% improvement. I have the quarterly reports here if you'd like to review the specific numbers." She reached for her portfolio again, but Richard waved his hand dismissively before she could open it. "That won't be necessary," he said, making another note on his pad. "Let's move on." Maya noticed that Richard had yet to make eye contact with her for more than a second or two. Throughout her career, she had learned to recognize the signs of someone who was uncomfortable with her presence. The avoidance of eye contact, the subtle dismissal of her achievements, the constant interruptions. "Let's talk about your technical knowledge," Richard continued, leaning back in his chair. "How familiar are you with AI-driven marketing analytics?" "I've implemented several AI-powered marketing platforms," Maya began confidently. "At Innovations, I led the transition to a machine learning model that could predict customer behavior patterns and—" "Yes, but have you actually worked with the code?" Richard interrupted. "Do you understand how these systems function at a technical level?" Maya took a slow breath before responding. This was a common tactic, moving the goalposts to find an area where she might fall short. The marketing director role description had specifically stated that technical knowledge was required, but coding skills were listed as a plus, not a requirement. "While I don't personally code the AI systems," she explained patiently, "I work closely with the technical teams to ensure the algorithms are properly trained on relevant marketing data. I've directed the development of custom dashboards that track key performance indicators and can interpret complex data patterns to inform strategy decisions. My strength is in bridging the gap between technical capabilities and practical marketing applications." Richard made a small, sound that somehow managed to convey doubt. "Summit Technologies has a very technically sophisticated team. We need people who can keep up." The implication was clear, and Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest. the feeling she'd experienced countless times when someone assumed her incompetence before she'd even had a chance to demonstrate her skills. She thought about James, about how he had described Summit's brilliant but somewhat homogeneous technical leadership, and understood exactly what Richard was doing, whether consciously or not. "I understand completely," Maya replied, her voice calm but firm. "In fact, my approach to marketing technology is precisely why the CTO at Innovations specifically requested I lead their product launches. I may not write the code, but I speak the language fluently enough to ensure marketers and developers work in harmony rather than at cross purposes." Richard glanced up, perhaps surprised by her confidence, then quickly looked down at his notepad again. "Well, let's move on to something else. Tell me about how you handle conflict in the workplace." Maya recognized the pivot, another common tactic when an interviewer's assumptions were challenged. "I believe in addressing conflicts directly but diplomatically. For example, when our design team and development team had fundamentally different visions for our user interface last year, I organized a workshop that started with each team experiencing the product from the other's perspective. By the end of the day, they had developed a hybrid approach that actually performed better with users than either original concept." "Interesting," Richard said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But what about when someone on your team just isn't performing? How do you handle difficult conversations?" Maya noted the immediate shift to framing her as potentially confrontational, a stereotype often applied to Black women in professional settings. "I approach performance issues with clarity and compassion," she said. "I believe most people want to succeed, and my job as a leader is to understand the barriers preventing that success. I set clear expectations, provide specific feedback, and work collaboratively to develop improvement plans. In cases where someone is genuinely not a good fit for their role, I have those conversations directly but respectfully." Richard made another note, then looked at his watch again. Maya had been tracking the time as well. They were barely 20 minutes into what should have been an hour-long interview, but Richard seemed eager to wrap up. "Let's talk about your family situation," he said abruptly. Maya kept her expression neutral, though internally she was adding another item to her growing list of inappropriate interview practices. "I'm not sure I understand how that's relevant to my qualifications for this position," she responded politely but firmly. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, this role requires significant commitment, sometimes late nights, occasional weekend work. We just need to know if you have obligations that might interfere with your availability." Family status questions were not only inappropriate but potentially illegal in job interviews. Maya knew this well, not just from her own HR knowledge, but from James's recent complaints about outdated practices he'd been working to reform at Summit since becoming CEO. "I understand the role's demands completely," she replied evenly. "My professional commitments have always been my top priority during working hours, and my track record of delivering results speaks to my ability to manage my time effectively. I wouldn't be applying for this position if I wasn't fully prepared to meet its requirements." Richard didn't seem satisfied with her answer but moved on. "And what about travel? We sometimes need our directors to visit clients or attend conferences with little notice. As my resume indicates, I've managed global marketing campaigns requiring extensive travel. Adaptability is one of my core strengths," Maya said, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the increasingly transparent attempt to find disqualifying factors. Richard glanced at her resume again. "Right. Well, let's talk compensation expectations. What salary range are you looking for?" Maya had researched the market thoroughly. "Based on industry standards for this position in this market, and considering my level of experience and track record of results, I would expect a range between $175,000 and $195,000, depending on the overall benefits package." Richard let out a small chuckle that made Maya's skin crawl. "That seems ambitious. We were thinking more along the lines of $120,000 to $130,000 for this role. That's quite generous considering market conditions." The significant gap between market rate and his offer was telling. Maya had seen this pattern before too. Women and minorities routinely offered less than their white male counterparts for identical roles. She wondered how NI-qualified candidates had accepted lower salaries simply because they didn't know their true market value. "I understand budget constraints can be a factor," Maya replied diplomatically. However, my research indicates that the market rate for this position with my level of experience is significantly higher than that range. Perhaps we could discuss the complete compensation package, including benefits, equity options, and performance bonuses, to find a solution that works for both parties. Richard's phone buzzed and he checked it immediately, seeming relieved for the distraction. I need to take this, he said, standing up. We're about done here anyway. Do you have any final questions for me? Maya had dozens of questions about the role itself, the team structure, the current marketing strategy, the product roadmap, all the things that should have been discussed in a proper interview. But it was clear that Richard had no intention of engaging in a genuine evaluation of her qualifications. Just one, she said, rising from her chair. What are the next steps in the interview process? Richard was already halfway to the door. We have several other candidates to meet with. If we decide to move forward, someone from HR will contact you within 2 weeks. 2 weeks, an unnecessarily long time frame that often indicated a lack of serious interest. Maya nodded, gathering her portfolio. Thank you for your time today, Mr. Cooper. I appreciate the opportunity to learn more about Summit Technologies. As they walked back toward the lobby, Richard maintained a brisk pace, checking his phone repeatedly and making no effort at conversation. Maya observed more of the office culture, the open workspace layout, the predominantly homogeneous executive offices, the subtle but noticeable segregation of staff by departments that seemed to correlate with demographics. Near the HR department, they passed a large conference room with glass walls where a meeting was taking place. Several men in suits were gathered around a table reviewing presentation slides. Maya immediately recognized her husband at the head of the table. Though she kept her expression neutral, Richard didn't notice her momentary recognition. His attention fixed on his phone as he guided her toward the exit. The receptionist can validate your parking, he said, his tone making it clear that their interaction was over. Thank you again, Maya said, extending her hand for a farewell shake. Richard seemed surprised by the gesture but gave her another quick, limp handshake. Yes, well, good luck with your job search, he replied, the dismissive phrasing making it clear he had already decided she wouldn't be proceeding further. As Maya turned to leave, she noticed the door to the conference room opening. She wondered if James would spot her, and what might happen if he did. Part of her hoped he wouldn't. She wanted to process this experience herself before discussing it with him. But another part of her was curious to see Richard's reaction if the connection was revealed. Maya maintained her professional demeanor as she approached the reception desk, even as her mind raced with thoughts about what she had just experienced. The subtle dismissals, the leading questions, the inappropriate inquiries about family, the lowball salary offer, none of these were unique in her experience. But seeing them at her husband's company, a company that prided itself on progressive values, was particularly disappointing. The receptionist smiled at her. How did your interview go? It was informative, Maya replied diplomatically. Could I trouble you for a parking validation? Of course, the young man said, taking her ticket. As he stamped it, he added in a lower voice, for what it's worth, Mr. Cooper rushes through all his interviews like that. Don't take it personally. Maya offered him a genuine smile, appreciating his kindness. Thank you for letting me know. As she turned to leave, she heard a familiar voice call out from across the lobby. Maya? James was standing near the elevator bank, surprise evident on his face. Maya hadn't planned for this encounter, at least not in such a public setting, but she maintained her composure. She had just experienced firsthand the treatment that candidates received from Summit's HR department, particularly those who didn't fit the apparent cultural fit mold. Now she had to decide how to handle this unexpected collision of her professional assessment and her personal connection. Richard Cooper was still visible through the glass walls of the department, now standing by his office door, speaking to another HR team member. He hadn't noticed James approaching Maya, hadn't made the connection yet. But in a few moments, everything would change. Maya took a deep breath and prepared for what would happen next. This interview had revealed far more than she had anticipated about Summit Technologies, and now the real test was about to begin. Maya? What are you doing here? James asked, his voice carrying across the lobby. Heads turned, including those of several employees standing near the reception desk. Maya smiled warmly at her husband, acutely aware of the curious gazes now directed at them. "Hello, James?" she replied, deliberately using his first name rather than a more personal greeting. James closed the distance between them, looking slightly confused but pleased to see her. He was dressed in his best charcoal gray suit, the one Maya had picked out for him last Christmas, and carrying a leather portfolio similar to her own. "I thought you had meetings all morning," he said, keeping his voice low. "I did have a meeting," Maya replied meaningfully, tilting her head slightly toward the HR department. "An interview, actually." Understanding dawned on James's face. "You went through with it," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and concern. "Here, today?" Maya nodded, watching his expression shift as he processed what this meant. Before either could say more, Maya noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Richard Cooper had emerged from the HR department and was walking briskly toward the executive elevator, his attention still focused on his phone. He hadn't noticed James and Maya standing together yet. "Mr. Cooper," James called out, his voice taking on the authoritative tone Maya recognized as his CEO voice. Richard stopped abruptly, looking up from his phone with surprise. "Mr. Wilson, I didn't know you were looking for me. I just finished an interview and was heading up to the executive meeting." "Yes, about that interview," James replied, gesturing toward Maya. "I understand you just met with Ms. Johnson?" Richard glanced at Maya, then back at James, confusion evident on his face. "Yes, for the marketing director position. I didn't realize you were involved in the hiring process for that role." The receptionist and several employees nearby had stopped pretending not to listen and were now openly watching the interaction. Maya maintained her professional demeanor, though she could feel her heart beating faster. This wasn't how she had planned to reveal her connection to James, but the moment had its own momentum now. "I try to stay involved in key hires," James said smoothly. "Maya, how did your interview go?" "I'd love to hear your impressions of the process." Richard's eyes darted between them, clearly trying to understand the nature of their relationship and why the CEO was asking a candidate for her feedback right in front of him. Maya considered her response carefully. This was a delicate moment. She could easily use her connection to James to humiliate Richard as he had attempted to humiliate her, but that wasn't her goal. What she wanted was meaningful change, not retribution. "It was enlightening," Maya replied diplomatically. "Mr. Cooper and I discussed my experience, though we didn't get into much detail about the specific requirements of the role or the marketing strategy moving forward." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Johnson has an impressive resume, but as I explained to her, we're looking for someone with more technical expertise and a better fit for our company culture." James raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? What aspects of her experience did you find lacking?" Richard's discomfort visibly increased. "Well, she has primarily worked in marketing implementation rather than technical development, and the role requires someone who can integrate seamlessly with our existing team dynamics." Maya watched as James processed this response, recognizing the coded language for what it was. The lobby had grown quieter, with more employees slowing their pace or finding reasons to linger nearby. "Interesting," James said, his tone carefully neutral. "Maya, would you mind sharing your thoughts on Summit's marketing needs based on what you've observed?" This was her opening, a chance to demonstrate her expertise while maintaining her professionalism. "From what I've researched, the Summit has a strong technical foundation but is struggling to communicate its value proposition to non-technical decision-makers. The website emphasizes features over solutions, and the current campaign structure doesn't effectively target the various stages of the buyer journey. With a more segmented approach and stronger storytelling, I believe Summit could significantly increase its market penetration, particularly in the mid-size enterprise space." James nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's a remarkably accurate assessment for someone who just walked in the door." Richard looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Mr. Wilson, if I had known you had a personal interest in this candidate—" "Personal interest," James repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose that's one way to put it." He turned to Maya. "I should probably introduce you properly. Richard, this is Maya Wilson Johnson, my wife." The silence that followed was profound. Richard's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, disbelief, embarrassment, and finally, poorly disguised panic. Several audible gasps came from the onlookers, followed by whispers. "Your wife?" Richard finally managed, his voice strained. I didn't. There was nothing in her resume. She used the name Johnson. I use my professional name for my work, Maya explained calmly. I've built my career under that name, and I wanted to experience the interview process as any other candidate would. Richard's face had turned a shade paler. Mrs. Wilson, I assure you, had I known who you were, that's exactly the problem, isn't it? Maya interrupted gently but firmly. The interview process should be the same for everyone, regardless of who they are or who they know. James placed a hand lightly on Maya's shoulder, a gesture of support that was not lost on the watching employees. Maya has been concerned about our hiring practices for some time. She suggested this approach as a way to experience our process firsthand. Richard swallowed hard. I can explain. It's been an extremely busy day, and perhaps I didn't give Mrs. Wilson the full attention her application deserved. But I assure you there was no intentional disrespect. Maya noticed how Richard's entire demeanor had changed, his posture straighter, his tone more deferential, his eyes now meeting hers directly. The transformation was telling. Richard, she said, keeping her voice level and professional, I don't believe you intentionally set out to treat me differently, but I do believe there are aspects of the interview process that should be examined more closely. James nodded. I agree. Richard, I'd like to meet with you and Diana from HR tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to discuss the interview process in more detail. Richard nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. Wilson, I'll clear my schedule. Good, James replied. And please bring the interview notes and evaluations from all candidates for the marketing director position over the past 3 months. I'd like to review them personally. Richard's discomfort was palpable now. All of them, sir? All of them, James confirmed, his tone making it clear this wasn't negotiable. More employees had gathered around, some pretending to be engaged in conversation while others openly watched the scene unfold. Maya was aware that this moment would likely become company lore, whispered about in break rooms and over lunch. That was fine. Sometimes meaningful change required a catalyst, a moment that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside. Maya turned to Richard, extending her hand. Thank you again for your time today, Mr. Cooper. I look forward to hearing the results of your candidate evaluation process. Richard took her hand, his shake firmer and more respectful than it had been earlier. Yes, of course, Mrs. Wilson, and I apologize if any part of our interview was less than professional. Maya nodded, accepting his apology without absolving him of responsibility. I believe we all have opportunities to grow and improve, Mr. Cooper. The important thing is recognizing those opportunities when they present themselves. James checked his watch. I should get back to my meeting. Maya, will you be joining us for lunch? Maya shook her head. I have another appointment, but I'll see you at home this evening. James nodded, understanding the subtext. She needed time to process the morning's events before discussing them further. I'll look forward to hearing more about your experience then. As James headed back toward the conference room, Richard stood awkwardly, clearly unsure of what to do next. Maya decided to end his discomfort. I should be going as well, she said. I'm sure you have other interviews scheduled today. I hope they'll receive your full attention and professional courtesy. Richard nodded quickly. Yes, of course, Mrs. Wilson. Again, I want to express my sincere apologies for any misunderstanding today. Maya offered a small smile. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Mr. Cooper. It was a learning opportunity. For all of us. With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, feeling the eyes of everyone in the lobby on her back. She maintained her professional posture until she reached her car in the parking garage. Once inside, she finally allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. The interview had confirmed her suspicions about Summit's hiring practices, the unconscious biases, the assumptions, the subtle but significant barriers put in place for candidates who didn't fit a certain mold. It was disappointing but not surprising. She had experienced similar treatment throughout her career. What was different this time was that she was in a position to do something about it. Not just because she was married to the CEO, but because she had the expertise and experience to identify the specific problems and recommend solutions. As she started her car, Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from James. You were right. We have work to do. Dinner at 7? Maya smiled and replied, Make it 8. I need to prepare my notes. And James? This isn't just about Richard. His response came quickly. I know. We'll fix it. Together. Maya put her phone down and pulled out of the parking space, her mind already organizing the observations and recommendations she would present to James that evening. What had happened today wasn't just about one bad interview or one biased HR manager. It was about systems and cultures that perpetuated inequity, often invisibly to those who benefited from them. As she drove away from Summit Technologies, Maya felt a sense of purpose stronger than she had in years. Today she had been humiliated, deliberately or not, by someone who saw her only through the lens of his own biases. But unlike many who experienced similar treatment, she had the opportunity to transform that moment into meaningful change. The real work was just beginning. The revelation in the lobby was just the first step in what would need to be a comprehensive examination of Summit's culture and practices. And Maya was ready for the challenge. By the time she reached the main road, Maya had already outlined a plan in her mind, not just for addressing Richard's behavior, but for identifying and addressing the systemic issues at Summit Technologies. This wasn't about punishment or public shaming. It was about creating a workplace where everyone had a fair opportunity to succeed based on their merits rather than their appearance or connections, and it had started with a simple interview, one that had revealed far more than either Richard, Cooper, or Summit Technologies had intended. The drive home gave Maya time to organize her thoughts. By the time she pulled into the driveway of their suburban home, she had mentally drafted a detailed analysis of everything that had gone wrong in her interview, not just for her own satisfaction, but as a roadmap for the changes needed at Summit Technologies. Inside, Maya kicked off her heels and changed into more comfortable clothes, then settled at the kitchen table with her laptop. She began typing rapidly, documenting each concerning moment from the interview while it was still fresh in her mind. The excessive wait time, Richard's dismissive body language, the interruptions, the lowballed salary offer, the inappropriate questions about family obligations, the emphasis on cultural fit, the dismissal of her portfolio without review. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear James come home until he was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. "You didn't have to wait until 8, she said without looking up, recognizing his presence by the familiar scent of his cologne. "I couldn't wait," James replied, loosening his tie as he crossed the room to pour himself a glass of water. "The executive meeting ended early, possibly because I was distracted by what happened in the lobby." Maya finally looked up, taking in her husband's troubled expression. "It made an impression, then?" James sat down across from her, running a hand through his hair, a gesture Maya recognized as a sign of his frustration. "Everyone's talking about it. 3 different department heads came to see me privately afterward. Turns out Richard's reputation for problematic interviews isn't new." "I'm not surprised," Maya said, turning her laptop so James could see her notes. "What happened today wasn't a one-off, James. It was systematic." James scanned her detailed account, his frown deepening with each paragraph. "Maya, I'm so sorry you had to experience this. When you suggested testing our interview process, I didn't think it would be this bad." "Don't apologize to me," Maya replied, her voice firm but gentle. "I've dealt with this kind of treatment my entire career. What matters is what happens next. What matters is all the other candidates who don't have the CEO as their husband, who don't get a chance to be heard when they're treated unfairly." James nodded, continuing to read her notes. "The salary discrepancy is particularly troubling. I authorized a range up to $210,000 for that position based on market research. He offered me $120,000 to $130,000, Maya reminded him, almost 40% less than the top of the approved range. I wonder what he offers to white male candidates with similar qualifications. We'll find out tomorrow, James said grimly. I've already asked Diana to pull the offer data for all positions filled in the last year, categorized by gender and ethnicity. Maya raised an eyebrow. That was fast. I was furious, James admitted, reaching across the table to take her hand on. Watching him backpedal when he realized who you were. It made me realize how many qualified people we've probably lost because of his biases. 6 months as CEO and I never saw it. You weren't meant to see it, Maya pointed out. That's how these systems work. The people at the top never experience the barriers, so they don't believe they exist. James was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. What do you think we should do about Richard? Maya had been considering this question all afternoon. The easy answer would be to fire him. It would make a statement, create an immediate sense of consequence. But would it solve the deeper problems? Firing Richard might feel satisfying, she said slowly, but it wouldn't address the underlying issues. He's a symptom, not the cause. James looked surprised. After how he treated you, you don't want him fired? Maya closed her laptop and leaned forward. What I want is meaningful change, James. If we fire Richard, everyone will see it as retribution because he was rude to the CEO's wife. It becomes about him and me, not about the systemic problems. The narrative becomes, don't cross the boss's wife, rather than, we need to create fair hiring practices. James considered this. So what do you suggest? Maya had been developing a plan since leaving Summit's offices. First, we need data. Comprehensive data on hiring patterns, promotion rates, salary disparities, everything broken down by gender, race, age. We need to know exactly how widespread these issues are. Diana can get that information together. James nodded. What else? Second, we need to revamp the entire interview process, Maya continued. Standardized questions, diverse interview panels, blind resume reviews, clear evaluation criteria. No more vague assessments of cultural fit that mask personal biases. That makes sense, James agreed. I'll have HR start working on new protocols immediately. Third, Maya said, her voice becoming more passionate. We need comprehensive training. Not just a 1-hour diversity seminar that everyone sleeps through, but ongoing education about unconscious bias, inclusive leadership, and equitable decision-making. And it needs to start at the top with you and your executive team. James raised his eyebrows. You think I need bias training? Everyone does, Maya replied gently. Including me. We all have blind spots, James. The difference is whether we're willing to acknowledge them and work to overcome them. James was quiet for a moment, processing her words. Then he nodded. You're right. I'll lead by example. What about Richard specifically, though? Maya had given this particular question the most thought. I think Richard should be part of the solution. He should help implement the new hiring practices, participate in the training, and be held accountable for measurable improvements in the diversity of his candidate pools and hires. And if he resists? James asked. Then he can find another job, Maya said firmly. But I think it's worth giving him the chance to learn and grow. Sometimes people don't recognize their biases until they're confronted with them directly, like he was today. James looked at her with admiration. You're remarkable, you know that? Most people would want revenge after being treated that way. This isn't about revenge, Maya replied. It's about justice. Not just for me, but for everyone who deserves a fair shot at opportunities they've earned. They were quiet for a moment, both reflecting on the day's events and the work ahead. Finally, James spoke again. Would you consider coming on as a consultant to help implement these changes? Maya had expected this question. I would, but I think we need to be careful about how we position it. It can't look like nepotism or special treatment. What if we bring in an outside firm and you work with them? James suggested. Your experience and expertise would be invaluable, but having an external partner would add credibility and address any concerns about favoritism. Maya nodded. That could work. I know several excellent DEI consultants who specialize in tech companies. Good, James said, squeezing her hand. I want to do this right, Maya. What happened today? It opened my eyes to problems I should have seen before. That's exactly why I suggested it, Maya replied. Sometimes we need to experience something personally to truly understand it. And now that you have indirectly, through me, you're in a position to create real change. Later that evening, after dinner, they sat on the couch together reviewing Maya's detailed notes and recommendations. James had already drafted an email to his executive team outlining his concerns in scheduling an emergency meeting for the following afternoon. After his morning meeting with Richard and Diana, do you think Richard will try to deny what happened? James asked as Maya reviewed his draft email. Maya considered the question. He might try to minimize it or explain it away. That's why documenting everything is so important. It's not about creating a gotcha moment. It's about having concrete examples to point to when discussing the problems. And what about tomorrow's meeting? Will you join us? Maya shook her head. No, I think that would make it too personal. This can't be about me or about you defending your wife. It has to be about creating systemic change. She paused, then added, Besides, I think Richard has been humiliated enough for one day. Having me there would only make him defensive, and that's not conducive to productive conversation. James looked at her with renewed appreciation. You've thought of everything. I've had years of practice navigating these situations, Maya reminded him gently. Most people who experience discrimination don't have the opportunity to address it directly. I'm fortunate that I can do something about it, not just for myself but for others. As they prepared for bed that night, Maya checked her phone one last time and found several messages from former colleagues who had heard about what happened at Summit. News traveled fast in their professional circles. One message in particular caught her attention from Tanya, a former coworker who now worked in HR at another tech company. Just heard what happened today. Proud of you for standing your ground. If you're serious about making changes at Summit, I have some resources that might help. Call me. Maya smiled, making a mental note to contact Tanya the next day. What had begun as a simple test of Summit's interview process was evolving into something much larger. A chance to create meaningful change in a company poised for growth. If they got it right, Summit could become an example for other organizations, proving that inclusive practices weren't just morally right, but also good for business. As she drifted off to sleep, Maya thought about all the times in her career when she had been underestimated, overlooked, or unfairly evaluated. Each of those experiences had been painful, but they had also prepared her for this moment, when she could finally do something to change the system itself, not just navigate it successfully for herself. Tomorrow would be just the beginning of a longer journey. Richard would face consequences, yes, but more importantly, Summit Technologies would begin the process of transformation. And Maya would be there to guide it, turning an uncomfortable interview into an opportunity for lasting impact. The clock on the bedside table read 11:48 p.m. when James whispered in the darkness, "What would you have done if I hadn't come out to the lobby when I did?" Maya smiled in the darkness. "I would have sent you a detailed email about my experience and suggested we discuss it over dinner. The outcome would have been the same, just with less dramatic flair." James chuckled softly. "I'm glad it happened the way it did. Sometimes people need a moment they can't ignore to really see what's been in front of them all along." "That's true," Maya agreed, thinking of Richard's face when he realized who she was. "But what matters now is what we do next. Tomorrow is just the first step." As she finally fell asleep, Maya felt a sense of purpose stronger than she had in years. What had started as an uncomfortable and humiliating experience had become an opportunity, not just for her, but for everyone at Summit Technologies who deserved a fair chance to succeed on their merits. And that, she thought as she drifted off, was worth far more than any job title or corner office could ever be. The morning meeting with Richard Cooper went exactly as Maya had predicted. According to James, who recounted the details over dinner that evening, Richard had arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a folder of interview notes and looking visibly nervous. He tried to explain it away at first, James said, twirling pasta onto his fork. Claimed he was having a particularly busy day, that he treats all candidates the same way. Maya raised an eyebrow. And then Diana pulled up the data, James replied with a grim satisfaction. 6 months of interview feedback, hiring decisions, and salary offers, all categorized by demographic information. The patterns were impossible to ignore. Male candidates, particularly white males, received significantly higher salary offers than women or people of color with identical qualifications. Interview notes for minority candidates frequently mentioned concerns about cultural fit or communication style, while white candidates were evaluated primarily on their technical skills and experience. The average interview time for white male candidates was 58 minutes. For women of color, it was 32 minutes. What was Richard's response to the data? Maya asked, genuinely curious about whether the HR manager was capable of recognizing his own biases. James sighed. Defensive at first, he argued that the salary differences reflected negotiation skills rather than bias. But when I asked him to explain why he offered you 40% below the approved range without any negotiation, he didn't have an answer. And the outcome? Maya pressed. We've put him on a performance improvement plan, James explained. He keeps his job for now, but with strict oversight and mandatory training. Diana will review all his hiring decisions and salary offers for the next 6 months, and he's been removed from direct interviewing responsibilities until he completes a comprehensive bias training program. Maya nodded thoughtfully. This aligned with her recommendation: consequences without immediate termination, a chance for growth and change rather than punishment alone. How did he take it? James finished his bite of food before answering. Better than I expected, actually. Once he got past the initial defensiveness, I think he was genuinely shocked by the patterns in his own decision-making. By the end of the meeting, he was asking questions about how to identify biases he might not be aware of. That's encouraging, Maya said. Most people aren't maliciously biased. They just don't see the patterns in their own behavior until someone points them out. The conversation shifted to the executive team meeting that had followed. James had presented a comprehensive plan for overhauling Summit's hiring and promotion practices, based largely on Maya's recommendations from the night before. The initial reaction had been mixed. Some immediate support, some subtle resistance, and plenty of uncomfortable shifting in seats. When James shared the data from HR, Neil from engineering tried to argue that the data was skewed because there just aren't enough qualified women and minorities in tech, James said, rolling his eyes. I asked him how he explained the fact that our competitors managed to find and hire them. Maya smiled. And what was his response to that? He didn't have one, James replied. But Lisa from product development jumped in with a story about how she was almost passed over for her current role because the previous CEO thought she wouldn't fit in with the guys. That changed the tone of the conversation. By the end of the meeting, the executive team had unanimously approved a series of immediate changes: standardized interview questions, diverse hiring panels, blind resume reviews, and mandatory bias training for all managers. They had also agreed to bring in outside consultants to conduct a more comprehensive assessment of Summit's culture and practices. I mentioned that you might consult with them, James added, reaching for his wine glass. As Maya Johnson, marketing expert, not as my wife. What was the reaction? Maya asked. Overwhelmingly positive, James replied. Your reputation in the industry speaks for itself. Several people mentioned your work at Innovation specifically. Maya felt a surge of professional pride. It was gratifying to know that her accomplishments were recognized, even separate from her connection to James. Over the following weeks, Summit Technologies began implementing the changes they had committed to. Maya connected them with Tanya, her former colleague who now specialized in inclusive hiring practices, and together they developed a comprehensive training program for the entire company. Richard Cooper, contrary to Maya's initial expectations, became one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the new initiatives. His initial meeting with Maya as a consultant had been awkward. He had apologized profusely for his behavior during the interview, stumbling over his words and avoiding eye contact. But once they moved past that uncomfortable moment and began discussing the actual work, Richard had shown a genuine desire to learn and improve. I never saw it, he admitted during one of their planning sessions, 3 weeks after the fateful interview. I always prided myself on being fair, on evaluating candidates objectively, but looking at the patterns in my own decisions, he shook his head, still processing the revelation. That's how unconscious bias works, Maya explained without judgment. It operates below our awareness. The important thing isn't that you had these biases, we all do. It's what you do once you become aware of them. By the end of the first month, Summit had already implemented several key changes. Every interview now involved at least 3 people from different departments, with standardized questions and evaluation criteria. Resumes were reviewed without names or identifying information that might trigger biases. Salary ranges were clearly established before interviews began, based solely on the role and experience level required. The most significant change, however, was the creation of an anonymous candidate feedback system. After each interview, candidates received a link to a survey where they could share their experience with a third-party firm that aggregated and anonymized the data. This provided ongoing accountability and a mechanism for identifying problems before they became patterns. We've received over 200 responses so far. Diana, the HR director, reported during a review meeting 6 weeks into the new process. The overall satisfaction scores have improved by 42% since implementing these changes. Maya, who attended the meeting as a consultant rather than the CEO's wife, felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. What had begun as a humiliating interview, experience was transforming into meaningful change that would benefit countless future candidates. The most surprising development came, too. months after Maya's interview, when Richard requested a meeting with her and James together. "I've been reviewing all my hiring decisions from the past 3 years," he explained, placing a thick folder on the conference room table. "And I've identified at least 15 candidates who I now believe may have been unfairly evaluated due to my unconscious biases." Maya and James exchanged surprised glances. "What are you proposing, Richard?" James asked. "I'd like to reach out to them," Richard replied, his usual confidence replaced by a humble determination, "to acknowledge the possibility that they weren't given fair consideration, and to invite them to reapply under our new hiring processes if they're still looking for opportunities." It was a bold suggestion, one that carried legal and reputational risks. Most companies would avoid any admission of potential discrimination, but it also demonstrated a genuine commitment to rectifying past mistakes. "It would need to be handled very carefully," Maya said thoughtfully. "The wording would be crucial." "I've drafted a proposed message," Richard said, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "I wanted your input before proceeding." Maya read the carefully worded letter, which acknowledged that Summit had recently revised its hiring practices to ensure fair evaluation of all candidates, and invited the recipient to reapply if they were interested. It didn't explicitly admit bias or discrimination, but offered a second chance that implied recognition of possible past inequities. "This is good," Maya said, genuinely impressed by Richard's initiative. "It's honest without creating legal liability, and it offers a concrete opportunity rather than just an apology." James nodded his agreement. "Let's have legal review it to be safe, but I think this is an excellent idea, Richard. It shows real leadership." Richard's face showed visible relief. "Thank you. This process has been eye-opening for me. Uncomfortable but necessary." After he left, Maya turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "You know, when this all started, I never expected Richard to become an ally. I thought he'd resist, make excuses, maybe even leave rather than change." "People can surprise you," James replied. "Sometimes they just need the right kind of push to see what's been in front of them all along." 6 months after Maya's interview, Summit Technologies released its first diversity and inclusion report, publicly sharing data on its hiring, promotion, and compensation practices, along with concrete goals for improvement. The report made no mention of the specific incident that had catalyzed these changes, but it did include a statement from the CEO about the importance of creating a workplace where everyone had equal opportunity to succeed. The report generated significant positive press, with several industry publications highlighting Summit as a model for other tech companies struggling with similar issues. Applications from women and minority candidates increased by 64% in the 3 months following the report's release. At home, reviewing the media coverage over breakfast, Maya felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional pride. "You know what's most meaningful about all of this?" she asked James, who was scanning the industry reactions on his tablet. "What's that?" he asked, looking up. "It's not just about Summit," Maya explained. 3 other tech CEOs have reached out to me in the past month, asking for guidance on implementing similar changes at their companies. What happened to me was just one interview, one moment, but the ripple effects could impact thousands of people we'll never even meet." James reached across the table to take her hand. "All because you were willing to put yourself in an uncomfortable position to expose problems most people would rather ignore." Maya smiled, remembering the nervous feeling she'd had walking into Summit Technology 6 months earlier, not knowing exactly what would happen but determined to uncover the truth. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from the most uncomfortable experiences. A week later, Maya received an unexpected email from a young black woman named Layla Taylor, who had recently been hired as a software developer at Summit. "Dear Ms. Johnson, I wanted to thank you personally for your work with Summit Technologies. I interviewed with the company a year ago and had such a negative experience that I nearly left the industry altogether. When I received the letter inviting me to reapply under their new hiring process, I was skeptical, but decided to give it one more chance. The difference was night and day. This time I was evaluated fairly, asked relevant questions about my skills and experience, and treated with respect throughout the process. I've been here for 3 weeks now, and I can already tell this is a place where I'll be able to grow and contribute. I don't know exactly what you did to transform Summit's culture, but whatever it was, it made a difference for me and many others. Thank you for making this space more accessible for people like me." Sincerely, Layla. Maya printed the email and pinned it to the bulletin board in her home office. Whenever people asked if all the effort had been worth it, the uncomfortable conversations, the resistance, the long hours developing new protocols and training programs, she would think of Layla and the others. Like her, who now had opportunities they might otherwise have been denied. The HR manager, who had once humiliated her, now led workshops for other companies on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias in hiring. The executive team that had once overlooked systemic problems now championed inclusive practices as a competitive advantage. And Summit Technologies, which had once been just another tech company with good intentions but problematic practices, was becoming a model for meaningful change in the industry. All because Maya had been willing to sit through an uncomfortable interview, to be judged unfairly, to experience what countless others experienced every day without the power to address it. Her humiliation had been transformed into something powerful, not through revenge or public shaming, but through persistence and a commitment to structural change. As she read Layla's email one more time, Maya thought about all the interviews yet to come, all the candidates who would walk through Summit's doors in the years ahead, unaware of the story that had changed their experience before they even arrived. They wouldn't know about Maya's interview, or Richard's biases, or the tense meetings that had followed. They would simply know that they were being evaluated fairly, treated with respect, and given the opportunity to succeed based on their merits rather than their appearance or connections. And in the end, that invisible change, that quiet transformation of systems and cultures, was the most meaningful victory of all.